So yeah, thank you, Katie. And so yeah, here we are to give the sort of the webinar and Q&A session on the new handicaps and classifications. This is being done by myself and also Mark Roberts, who hopefully some of you can see. So just as a brief introduction, who we are, sort of beyond what Katie kindly said. So we're both people who've been in archery for a while and held various club positions, including club and county records officers, working in sort of data fields, and we're both administrators of these websites that provide some of the tooling for the new handicaps and classification system, so the Archery Calculator and the Archery Geekery website. So as a bit more detail, we are both volunteers, so we're two individuals who sort of want to work and improve the sport, and sort of looking for ways that we can do that from the abilities that we have. So we first responded to a call for updating the awards system actually quite a long time ago when we worked on the Barebow Rose Awards together. And it was sort of from the Barebow Rose Awards, some of the concepts that we needed to apply to update the classifications came about. So yeah, we should clarify that we're not paid by Archery GB or Archery GB employees. We can't comment on Archery GB policy as a whole, but we're here specifically for sort of the applying data and maths to the handicaps and classification system. And yes, offering time, and my God, it has taken a lot of time, but we are finally there. So this presentation really aimed at almost anyone within Archery GB. I think it will be useful for records officers to be attending or to be watching, to then take some of the information here that's sort of a deeper dive into the classifications and handicaps to be able to answer questions back at a club level. So part of this is about sort of the dissemination of information. It's also useful for archers who want a deeper understanding of how this all fits together. So I think previously, having lived with the old classification for so long, a lot of it was very ingrained. People knew, if you named a classification, people knew exactly what handicap corresponded and how everything sort of fitted together into one whole. And that's been more difficult sort of approaching a newer system. So part of that's why we're here. And then just anyone who sort of wants to understand some of the reasoning behind some of the updates and have some of the questions answered that were submitted.
Sorry, Jack, just before you jump in, just on questions there. So there were questions submitted in advance, and some of those are answered at the end of the presentation. If there are more questions that come up during, please just drop them in the chat box, and we will, well, if they're simple, I might just answer them on the spot in the chat, or we'll put them in the right place later on when we come to that category of questions. So please just keep the questions flooding through in the chat box, and we'll endeavour to get to them all at some point. Yeah,
and I say we are very keen to answer questions, sort of try and share knowledge and understanding. So coming to why update the classification systems? Well, there's a few reasons which I'll go into here. There's increased standards, sort of some of the what we call anomalous features from the old system. There are the new age groups and new rounds that have been introduced by Archery GB since the old classification system. And then there's sort of the big one is the question about its suitability for archery today. So talking about the increased standards, the classification scores were set sort of a number of years ago. And archers now are shooting higher scores than when these thresholds are set. Largely, this is due to increased participation, which is good for the sport. And this is reflected by the fact that perhaps the most significant areas we've seen this increase in ability is within the female and barebow categories. In addition to this, I think there's also increased technology, which helps bring scores up and sort of just a more formal treatment across the board. So it's time that the classification sort of needed a revamp to keep them up to date with where we are today. Slightly bigger issue that we wanted to tackle was what we call the anomalous features. So with the old classification system, a lot of these had been sort of slave to statistics. So people might be familiar with the idea that when the score thresholds were set, all the scores, competition scores from across a large number of competitions were taken, and then the MB score was set at the top 4%, the Bowman score was set at the top 10% or 14%, etc., etc. And this led to problems with, in certain areas, be due to the fact that there were odd things happening in certain places each year. So one particularly glaring problem is that obviously the year the scores were set was a very good year for under 18 ladies longbow. So if we look at the old classification system, you can see here that to get a second class score on a Hereford, an adult and an under 18 had to shoot the same score, yet to get classifications above this, the under 18 actually has to outshoot the adult lady longbow, which just isn't logical. And there's a few places this crops up across the classification tables. The second issue, which is sort of again comes from the fact that everything was slave to statistics, is that you get unpredictable boundaries. So you look at some places, there's a very, very wide, say, first class, followed by a medium-sized Bowman boundary, and then a tiny, tiny MB class. So this can be seen if we look at the old classifications. So here, these are, along the bottom is the handicap, and these are all the different classifications. So you can see here, as you go up in age, sort of the handicap required for a classification decreases, i.e. the score goes up. But if we pick out, say, where the longbow ladies, we can see here that in fact the under 18s have got to be shooting much higher scores than the adult ladies, and the adult ladies are in fact required to shoot scores more comparable to the under 16s. And then picking out here, here's this kind of, you've got these quite nicely spaced third, second, first Bowman classifications, but then you have this tiny, tiny MB band for ladies barebow, followed by the GMB band, which sort of doesn't quite match up to some of the other categories, and so leaves this sort of very unpredictable. It may take you a while to get from Bowman up to MB, but then by the time you've got MB, it's almost straight into GMB afterwards. So sort of go on, Mark.
Sorry, I was just going to say the other interesting thing on some of these, so that the triangles and circles and squares on there show the national records, and you can see for some of them, like longbow gents under 18, for example, to get a JMB, you would have had to break all three of those national records, and yeah, that's just not realistic or fair on some of those. So that was one of the other criteria that we looked at when setting the new boundaries.
Yeah, so sort of all of this comes out of the fact that setting of the old scores was very, very heavily tied to a set of competitions in a particular year, and gives rise to some of these funny features which can make it a bit difficult to navigate. So then there's the new age groups and rounds. So in 2022, Archery GB introduced a new set of age groups. These were done to align Archery GB better with World Archery and reduce some of the confusion that juniors have when entering different competitions. It was also done to support junior development. So the juniors at a younger age now are sort of grouped together across gender, with, say, the under 12 girls and boys shooting the same rounds and the same distances, whilst there's a break point at under 15, under 16, as it moves up in towards the adult distances. In addition to this, there's also now a 50 plus and an under 21 category, again aligning with the World Archery categories. And the fact is that under the old system, we didn't have any support for these in terms of classifications. So we want to add these groups to the classifications or regroup the juniors to follow the current age guidelines. In addition to this, there's been a number of new rounds since the last classifications were developed. For example, there's the WA50 barebow that's been introduced. As well as these, there's the metric 122 and the metric 80 rounds that Archery GB have to go along with the 720 rounds. And indoor, we've had the Vegas 300, etc. And again, none of these rounds have yet appeared in the tables and should be included in there. And so finally, sort of taking a step back, a lot of those previous things are not easy fixes, but at least could have been straightforward fixes. But we also wanted to ask, how suitable is the classification scheme for target archery in the UK today? So this is a scheme that's intended to drive progression. But if we think about it, actually, it's often quite hard to get started. As you come off your beginner's course, gents have to start shooting at 50 meters, ladies at 40 meters to get their third class, which is often inaccessible to someone who's just finished shooting 20 yards or even someone who's sort of 1 year in. And by the time they have reached these distances, their abilities often developed sufficiently that they're actually closer to second class, meaning that they blast through the lower classifications, and then lots and lots of archers get stuck around this sort of first class bowman, what we called purgatory, where it's quite a lot of work to get up to MB. And a lot of people stay there, plateau there, and sort of lose interest in the classification system after ticking it off each year. Secondly, one of the main uses I think a lot of people have for the classification system is to make comparisons between different categories, so different bow styles, different genders, different ages. And as we've seen previously, these standards have changed sort of in a non-uniform manner. And so the previous statements that were often made about percentiles were no longer true. And it would be good to kind of try and realign some of these, as well as trying to improve some of those anomalous features that we saw. And finally, there's a question around rounds and tournaments. So many clubs have seen a decrease in target days, which are sort of required for the classifications. And in addition to this, we've seen a vast increase in the number of 720 events being hosted. This is sort of driven from policy at World Archery level, where many of their tournaments have changed, driving changes at the domestic level. And so there's a lot of these events, in addition to the York, Hereford, Bristol and WA 1440 events going on. So is it possible to sort of change and reflect that? So that's the classifications. In terms of the handicaps, there's a couple of things we can comment on here. So I think it's well known that there's a fairly poor comparison between indoor and outdoor handicaps. Most archers, not all of course, but most archers find that their indoor handicaps are typically a few points higher. And that's sort of not at the end of the seasons, but for all the rounds they shoot, handicaps are coming out higher than they do for the outdoor rounds. Secondly, there's what we would say poor behaviour at long distance. So you may have noticed that the longer distances often appear harder for the low handicap archers than the short distances, whereas the longer distance often appear easier for the high handicap archers than the shorter distances, meaning that if you shot a number of different distances and looked at your handicap, it doesn't appear consistent throughout. And this is due to the what we call the excess dispersion factor, for those who are familiar with David Lane's work on the equations. And this is what led to sort of some of the slightly silly scores you would see sometimes for say junior under 12 juniors would need a score of something like 4 on a York to claim a classification. And this was a result of sort of this blow up at higher handicaps. Another issue was that improvements of -1 didn't show up. So what I mean by this is when you have a handicap, the way you improve that handicap is to shoot another score. It then gets averaged with your handicap, and your new handicap becomes that rounded up to the nearest number. The result of this was that you could have a handicap of, say, 34, and if you shot 10 scores of 33 handicap, this would always be rounded back down to a 34. So you could have an archer that consistently shot better than their current handicap throughout the season, and it would never be shown if it was only an improvement of 1 point. And finally, an important note that the classifications are built around the handicap system. So there's a need to sort of address the two of these together. We can't do one without the other. So having set the scene for why we might want to make some changes, I'm now going to go over the new systems. What has changed? There was a press release with all of this, but we're going to go into a little bit more depth about what's changed and how it all fits together. So for the handicaps, actually, we're going to start with what hasn't changed. So the process is still the same. You shoot a score. It can be any score on any round that appears in the tables. You can shoot an age-appropriate round. You can shoot a much shorter round. You can shoot a much longer round than you would normally do. It doesn't matter, any round, any distance. And once you've got the score, you look at the handicap. Once you've got 3 scores, these are averaged together to get a handicap. After each successive score you then shoot, this is combined with your handicap and averaged to get an update. And then at the end of the year, this average, you have an average taken of your best 3 handicaps to start the new year. And we have separate indoor and outdoor handicaps. So this is all as it always was on the surface. So the new features, if we dig a bit deeper, so just to help people with understanding the process behind this, what we did was sort of look at the handicap equations, look at different forms of the equations as might suit modeling archery. And then we took a range of data from a number of different competitions, all the way from sort of club level domestic competitions within the UK up to world-class events from the World Cups and across all bow styles, and sort of use this data to apply some sort of optimization techniques to come up with the best form for a handicap equation to fit. So the features of this new system are that there's better distance scaling. So where we previously saw sort of the high handicap scores blew up at longer distance, there's now much better distance scaling. There's better indoor and outdoor comparison. And part of this is the previous equations assumed an arrow diameter of a typical platinum arrow, both indoors and outdoors. Whereas now we treat outdoors with a typical recurve carbon arrow and the indoors with a larger diameter. And this, coupled with the distance scaling, means that you should get better comparison between handicaps indoors and outdoors. There's a wider range on the handicap. So previously, where it ran 0 to 100, we now run 0 to 150. This means that there's room for, you can sort of increase the granularity or decrease the spaces between each handicap, which mean that you can cover sort of a wider range of scores. And there's also the potential now for negative handicaps to serve scores that are sort of over this typical 0 handicap point of 1400 on the 1440 or 700 on the 720. So archers who are shooting those very big scores, there is now the option to go below that. They don't appear on the official tables, but the apps and the tooling does include that. And so the final thing, which is the big difference, is that you now round down instead of rounding up. And this has been changed to address that the issue we previously discussed, where you could consistently shoot 1 handicap point better than your handicap all season and never see an improvement. Whereas now, by rounding down, as soon as you shoot even 1 handicap point better, that will be reflected in an improvement in the handicap, which is it's a subtle change, but it does make that important difference. So moving on to the classifications, this table presents sort of quite a nice summary, and I think there's various ones of these that you've probably seen. People should be quite familiar with this by now. So under the new system, we have 3 separate tiers. the archer, the bowman, and the master bowman tiers. And each of these have 3 sub-tiers running from 3rd up to 1st class. And then the master bowman tier has master bowman, grandmaster bowman, and now this additional category of the elite master bowman. In a slight departure from the previous system, rather than being gained after shooting a set number of rounds, classifications now are gained after shooting a set number of arrows. So same concept, just a slightly different approach. The rounds you can shoot, now all rounds of appropriate distance can be used for the bottom 2 tiers. And at the top, we've got any 1440 York, Hereford, Bristol, or 720 rounds as appropriate to a particular category. When it comes to events, the entry level, the archer tier scores can now be shot at any event, anywhere within the club and administered by the club. The bowman tier scores remain shot at any competitive event and are administered by the clubs. And I know this has raised a lot of questions, so I will be going into this shortly. And finally, as it always has been, the master bowman tier will be required record status competitions, so UK or world record status, and will be administered by Archery GB. The full details of this, like I say, don't rely on just a table. There's a lot more detail surrounding the governance of this that can be found in the Shooting Administrative Procedures SAP 7, which is linked down here and available on the Archery GB website. So again, thinking about what hasn't changed within the classifications, really on the surface, a lot of it is the same. Archers have to go out, they have to shoot some rounds, they need to look up in the classification tables what the classification they get for that score is. And then once they've shot enough at that level, they can claim a classification. So this is the same as it always has been. Go out, shoot rounds, look at the classification. Once you've done enough at that classification, you claim it. So this is an example of one of the new classification tables. You can see they're now grouped by category, whereas previously you had to go through and they were grouped by round, meaning that for all the different rounds for your bow style, for your gender, for your age, it was a bit of a search through. Now you've got one table that gives you all the information you need. Highlighted are the suggested rounds. So these are rounds that would be sensible for someone of that classification to be shooting. So if you were, I believe this is the under 18 gents table here. If you were looking at getting your A3 classification, we would suggest you would be shooting maybe metric 4.5, Bristol 4.5. It doesn't mean you have to. There is a score there available for the York, but for someone who's coming in at this level, maybe off a beginner's course or a year into archery, this is sort of more ideal, going to be more ideally suited to them. But it's not a requirement. They can shoot any of these scores in the tables. Highlighted are the sort of the suggested round, in bold are the age appropriate rounds and the rounds that can be used for claiming records on. And so what you would do is you go out, shoot a score, say I've done a metric 2, I've scored 750. I come along, I can see that 750 is in between A1 and B3. So that's going to give me 12 dozen arrows at an A1 score, meaning that I could claim my A1 classification because I've shot the 12 dozen arrows. So in terms of what has changed, the key things, as we've just been over in that table, the number of rounds is now the number of arrows. There's this new concept of the prestige rounds. We've got new age categories, and the way those age categories are structured has changed. The scoring standards has changed slightly. And the most important thing that I think you want to focus on for explaining to club members is that the idea of the journey through the classifications is now much nicer, I feel. So the first change is this number of arrows. So previously you had to shoot 3 rounds for a classification, and there was a complex set of restrictions on which rounds could be used for which classifications, by which I mean something like a Warwick, which was a 4 dozen round, could only be used for the lowest classifications. You couldn't use Warwick scores, no matter what distance they were shot at, to claim some of the higher classifications first class bowmen. Whereas now we've got a fixed number of arrows, which means that it's fair for everyone. It doesn't matter. There's no fishing around for easy rounds or sort of cheating the system. Everyone has to shoot the same number of arrows. And it also means that we can now make all rounds of an appropriate distance eligible for all of the classifications up to the bowman first class level. The way these numbers were set is by looking at the previous schemes. So previously you could shoot three Warwicks to claim your second and third class, which would have been 12 dozen. So 12 dozen is what we now require for the archer tier. Then you would have had to shoot at least 3 6 dozen rounds to claim your bowman or first class classification. So now we have the 18 dozen arrows required to claim the bowman tier classifications. And finally, previously you would have had to shoot 3 12 dozen rounds to claim anything in master bowman or grandmaster bowman. And so similarly, we have the requirement for 36 dozen to claim any of the master bowman tier classifications. And the fact that these rounds are now more accessible means that clubs can be running any rounds for their target days or at club evenings, whereas previously you might have been restricted from running, say, a Warwick because archers looking for first class or bowman didn't want to shoot it. It's now possible to run a Warwick for everyone to claim classifications up to the top of the bowman tier. And the Warwick, of course, lends itself very well to sort of a club evening shoot. So that's the first change. The next change to look at is this concept of the prestige rounds. So these are sort of prominent rounds within UK archery that will override any other requirements that may exist within the classification tables, for example, minimum distances, etc. And so what this means is that all classifications will always be available on these sets of rounds. And these rounds, important in UK and international archery, are the York Hereford Bristol rounds, the WA 1440 and associated metric rounds, and finally the international competition round, which at the moment is the WA 720. And I should have added on to there, this will also include for juniors any of the metric 720 rounds. And master bowman's tier scores must always be shot on one of these rounds at a UK record status or world record status event.
Sorry, Jack, I think it's that I mean, this is a new word. We haven't used the word prestige before, but this concept has always been there. It's always been the case that only certain round families were eligible for the master bowman tier things. It's just that there's one more round family added in there now, and it's got a new name, prestige.
Yes.
So the concept is not new.
Yes. So age categories. So the tables now reflect the updated Archery GB and World Archery categories. In particular, note the inclusion of the 50+ tier and the under 21 tier, which will be, these are sort of very new concepts. People in these age categories didn't have anything that existed for them before, so they are a particularly new, a new concept. And hopefully the sort of the availability of these 50+ rounds and the under 21 will go some way into encouraging archers to participate in the scheme and participating in shooting. Within the junior age categories function much as they always did, but it's important to note that there's a break point at under 15 and under 16. So I mentioned before the junior age categories that were introduced had the under 14s, under 15s shot together at the same distances, regardless of gender. In a way to match this, the under 15, under 14s junior classifications also hold at the same handicaps, the same scores. So reflecting sort of the equality in development, juniors are required to get the same scores at the younger ages. There's then this break point at under 15 and under 16, where the age groups diverge and move out towards their senior senior distances, senior handicaps, senior scores. In addition to this, we've also included all of the new rounds within the classification tables and handicap tables. And should there be more rounds added in future, it should hopefully be relatively straightforward to do this now. So there shouldn't be the delay that we saw with the barebow WA50, for instance. So finally, the score standards. So the entry point to the classifications have now become easier to achieve than they were previously, by which I mean the Archer tier is now accessible to everyone, and it can be claimed from any scores shot within any environment, as long as they were shot to the rules of shooting. And this is a change from where it was previously set at the same requirements as the Bowman tier scores. So the Bowman tier scores on the table required what we said, any competitive event. I think there's been a lot of confusion over this. So this is the same as it has always been within the shooting administrative procedures for the classifications, which requires any club shoot shot to the Archery GB rules of shooting, and could be a target day, a poster league, a club competition, anything like that. So this is how it's always been, whereas now the Archer tier, actually, we're relaxing that requirement, as many clubs already had done, to say that people can claim the first level of scores simply from scores they shoot at a club in practice. And finally, the Master Bowman tier, this has remained unchanged. It requires a UK record status or a world record status event. And it can only be claimed directly from Archery GB via an electronic form on the website, whereas the Archer and the Bowman tier are administered at a club level. So the main thing I want to talk about is the journey through the classification system. And I think I would sum this up by saying it's an improved accessibility for archers across all the categories. So firstly, there's now an increased number of classifications. There's now 9 classifications, and this has expanded the range for both the newest and the highest performing archers. So the bottom threshold has been reduced with the Archer third class tier, aimed at people who are very, very new, whilst the Elite Master Bowman tier at the very, very top has been designed to stretch those who were already comfortably achieving GMB scores. In addition to this, we've also put more steps across the centre. So now there's hopefully a better pathway through from sort of the Bowman tier up to the Master Bowman tier, where previously there was this, as we called it, first class Bowman purgatory, where a lot of archers would get stuck and disenfranchised. There's new distance requirements. So this is actually also a result of increasing the number of classifications. And this means that the Archer third class now starts at a distance of 30 meters for all archers. So again, this makes it much more accessible for those who've been shooting maybe a year or recently came off a beginner's course. It's a distance people can rapidly work towards, and a distance that's appropriate for the skill level of the scores that are being required, and more accessible. And then finally, when we were preparing the classifications, we made sure that we didn't run into the mistake of the previous system that was overly focused on the data, but instead we sort of developed a sensible system that was informed by the data. So what we have now is a consistent handicap step for all classifications, ages, and genders, and this will become clearer in a second. One of the results of this is that we now have no anomalies where it's easier to be an adult than it is to be an under 18. It also gives us a predictable progression in both classification. So the bands are of equal size, meaning that it's sort of an equal level of progression to work through them, rather than having sort of a lot of work to get to NB and then a very, very short MB band before we hit GMB. It's now much more standardized. It also means that for age groups, there's a much more sensible progression. Previously, you had it where sometimes juniors would move up an age group and have to shoot exactly the same scores to get the same classifications. some years. Other years they would move up an age group and find that they'd drop down 2 classifications because of the way the data was when the scores were set. Again, I mentioned before, the juniors now align below under 15 and split at under 16. And so what we did was we constructed this sensible stepping system and then fitted data from UK competitions, a wide variety. So these included the Junior National Outdoor Championships, the over 50 Masters, the British Target Championships, a number of large club shoots. And we also had a large data bank that was provided to us to assist with this. So this is most easily demonstrated by if we look at the classification bands for the new system. And this is a little bit small, but you don't need to read the details. It's very similar to the diagram we saw earlier. Along the bottom here is the handicap, and the blue scores here are the Archer tier, the red scores are the Bowman tier, and the gold scores are the Master Bowman tier. And you can see now there's a nice sort of consistent progression through the age categories, where a junior who's shooting one age category 1 year, as they move up, they can expect to be shooting 1 classification down if they don't improve, approximately. It varies slightly between different bow styles, but again, you can see if you were shooting where we were under 16 Bowman 3rd class here, if they move up an age group, that's a bad example, isn't it? If they were an under 16 Bowman 1st class, as they move up an age group, they'll drop down to an Archer 1st class. Similarly, as we move along, so you can see that the width of these bands are all much more uniformly spaced, meaning that there's a predictable level of progression you have to go through each classification before you attain the next one. Is there anything you wanted to add on that, Mark?
No, I was just saying that, yeah, you picked on one of the examples where there's a sort of a half step in the girls, and I think, I mean, this is because they are tied at the bottom end. So as Jack said earlier, the lower the lower age groups all start the same and have the same scores, but because there's this under 15, under 16 step, there's often a half step in the girls where they sort of come into line with the boys' scores going down to the under 14 and under 12s. Yeah. So I mean,
I think it's very clear in the barebow scores here, where you can see actually the under 15 to under 16 girls don't change, whereas the boys do.
Yes, yeah, and so there's a few sort of fudges and workarounds like that, but generally these scores, I think it's worth saying that these scores are probably not perfect. I mean, there's a lot of work gone into making sure that they're good, and they're certainly not broken in the ways that the previous ones were. But this is, I think, a really good starting point, and we will keep them under review as well. I think after this first season, this first outdoor season goes through with these, we'll be definitely looking for feedback from people about where scores were too high or too low, and we can look at reviewing those. But I think this is a decent starting point for this new era, and we can iterate it from there. So a lot of these things which have these perfect size steps probably will evolve away from that. I think as we over the years, as more data comes in, if we find that things are too high or too low, we can make tweaks to this. It's not hard coded that they must be equal size steps, but I think for a starting point, this is a good place to go from.
Yeah, and I think what was I going to say? So I'll come on to it in the next slide, but one of the things is a lot of the issues within the old classification system, I think, came from the fact that they hadn't been changed for a long time, and sort of issues, or they'd come out of sync with archery, whereas we would like to see this reviewed at a relatively consistent rate from now on, maybe every 3 years or something, to make sure that it does keep pace.
And just on that, I think one of the other big changes that's, I guess, not obvious from the outside is that we're much better set up now to make quick changes to this. I think the old system had a lot of legacy issues with it. The new system is much more, it's fully digital, let's say. It's much easier to change it in the future if new data drives it in different directions, or if there's demand for new bow styles, new categories, those sorts of things. It should be much easier in the future from this point on.
Yeah, but again, at the same time, we're not going to sort of, just because someone sets a new national record, we're not going to immediately bump all the scores up. We're not going to be sort of tied to individual data points in the way the old scheme was. It'll be a much smoother massaging into the new system. So yeah, as Mark touched on briefly there, the other big change with this is that we've improved accessibility for the digital age. So there's no copyright restrictions on these handicap systems or their classification systems as there were in the previous one. All of the data, all of the handicap tables are completely available to all Archery GB members, and in fact all non-Archery GB members. The tables are fully available as PDFs online, and they're much easier to use. You now just need one table for all the rounds in your bow style, rather than having to carry around sort of several sheaves of paper with everything in it. All of the data for constructing, say, apps or spreadsheets or websites has been made fully available, and we are more than happy to provide assistance. Indeed, we've already been in we've worked closely with a number of people in Golden Records, Expert Archer, our own 2 websites, to help them make these updates ready in time for this outdoor season. So I was just going to demonstrate briefly. If you want to find some of this information, you need to go to the Archery GB website and then resources and classifications. So hopefully it will load if I give it a second. So the Archery GB website under resources, and then here you've got outdoor classifications and handicaps. And the most important thing to highlight, I think, is this section on the right here, which is where you have quick links to all of your classification tables, the changeover procedures for this year, the Excel spreadsheet, the handicap table, and also the shooting administrative procedures. And I would stress again, the shooting administrative procedures are where you will find a lot of answers and a lot of the hard wording for the rules. Okay, so in summary, hopefully what we have is a more accessible scheme updated for today's archery. And the highlights of this are the fact that the newest archers can start at 30 meters, and it's a very informal entry point. They can shoot a number of different rounds, and they can shoot it in a very informal way to get started on their classification journey. We've then provided more classifications and tooled them in such a way that there's much better stepping stones to progression. And we've made all of this sort of open source with digital resources to help support clubs and support archers. So on to questions. I'll deal with the questions that were sent, either frequently asked questions or questions that were sent in on the Excel spreadsheet, and then we can have a look at some of the questions in the chat. So the first point is that if your question hasn't been answered here, it may well already have an answer on the frequently asked questions page. We did put a lot of work into this, and there's a lot of things that were tackled here, so please do check this. Secondly, if you want definitive wording on any of the rules, don't use a web page. Please go to the shooting administrative procedures, specifically SAP 7 for the classifications and SAP 9 for the handicaps. And then thirdly, any guidelines for transitioning between the previous system and the new ones this year can be read in the changeover procedures, which is on the web page I just showed previously. So the first question, I think, is badges. This is where the most questions come in. Will there be new badges? When will they be out? How much will they cost? Who will be selling them? And I should say, Mark and I have not been involved with the new badges. I believe that there are some new badge designs, and Archery GB are just finalising the details with suppliers and vendors. And if there are more questions about this, perhaps Katie can answer them shortly. As an intermediate step, what we would perhaps suggest is using a 1, 2, 3 badge for the archer tier, and then combining this 1, 2, 3 badge with the existing bowman badge for the bowman tier until these the full details of the badges are released. The second question I think a lot of people ask is what is meant by competitive event on the bowman tier scores. The definitive wording, as I've said, is provided in the administrative procedures. So this is anything shot under the Archery GB rules of shooting at a meeting organised by Archery GB or an affiliated body, at any associated club target day, and club target days are outlined in the rules of shooting rule 313. So this is not a new ruling. This has always been the case for all classification scores. If you look at the older shooting administrative procedures, this is very, very similar to what has always been in there. So it's in fact now easier to access the lowest tier archer classifications.
I think
for those wanting specific guidance, I would say that these claims are being dealt with by clubs, and the idea is that clubs should deal with these in the spirit of the rules as they see appropriate. So we would suggest target days, postal shoots, internal competitions, etc. Anything where there is some kind of competitive atmosphere and it's not simply turning up and shooting. And it's something that's encouraging a competitive environment. Mark?
No, I was just going to make the point and just reiterate the point that you said earlier in the slide, that this has always been the case. And I think most people have forgotten that. It's one of those rules that's been lost in the midst of time, but it's always been the case that all classifications should be shot at a club target day at the very least. Yes. So I think that's something that a lot of clubs have just disregarded and tended to award classifications at any club practice session. But this is definitely not a change in that respect. If anything, like you say, it's a change that weakens that rule and allows at least the archer tier ones to be claimed anywhere, anytime.
Yeah, and as I say, Archery GB aren't going to be conducting spot checks. What we are doing is, like you say, we are relaxing the rules, and on top of that, really, it's hoped that this will maybe drive the uptake of target days. I know certainly our club has been putting on more target days this summer than it previously did, which has been a good thing for the club. So age groups, often people ask, I think 50 plus is too high an age group for the Masters category, too low an age group. I think it should be 67, 85, 106, whatever it be. The answer is that this is an age group set by World Archery and out of our control. If you do think that there should be more categories, perhaps a 65 or a 67 category, then please do consider sort of campaigning for this and raising awareness. It was indeed the case with the Barebow Rose Awards that I mentioned previously. People saw that there was a need for this, they constructed a campaign, and eventually it got implemented. Can you hold multiple classifications for different ages? So could you be, say, both an adult and a 50 plus classification? The answer is yes, you can hold in as many categories as you are eligible for. And this has indeed always been the case for juniors, who could always sort of shoot up into a higher age group. All I would say is that you use the tables as appropriate to each. So if you are a 16-year-old and you want to claim a senior classification, you need to use the senior tables for that. Can you use one score towards multiple classifications? So if you are a 50 plus and you say you're a 50 plus lady and you shoot a Hereford, can you use this towards your 50 plus classification and your adult classification? Yes. Another question we had come in was around Rose Awards and WA Stars, and whether these can be claimed from shooting an appropriate 50 plus round. The answer to this is a little bit more complicated. So for the Rose Awards, yes. For example, a 50 plus lady shooting a Bristol 2 could claim a Rose Award off that round. For the World Archery Stars or the World Archery Target Awards, these are governed by World Archery, so you can't claim a star or a target from a 50+ round, but you can claim a silver star or a silver target. And these are different awards that are available for 50+ and cadets. And then finally, for the home nation the home nation awards, so the crosses, the leeks, daffodils, knots, thistles, these will all be up to the individual home nation to make a ruling on. What should you put on an entry form? So for classifications and handicaps, it doesn't matter what you enter the competition as, it just matters what you are and what score you get on that day. It doesn't matter whether you entered as a 50+, whether you entered as an adult, under 21, etc. All other details around organising the tournament are left to the tournament organiser. So it's up to the tournament organiser whether they want to include these new categories. It's up to the tournament organiser whether they want to award them. But it is expected that if you enter a tournament and you enter as a 50+, then you will be shooting the age appropriate round, i.e. you can't, a 50+ gent can't enter a York and expect to be awarded for the York because the age appropriate round would have been a Bristol 1. But as I say, a lot of this is at the discretion of the tournament organiser. A question about national rankings. At the moment, I believe only the adult categories have a national ranking. As I say, this could well change in the future, depending on the uptake of the 50+ category. But this is a question for Archery GB to answer, rather than us as the designers of the scheme. This moves more into the policy questions. Okay, you missed me out. So we would like to update classifications across the board, and we'd like to do it sort of for as much as we can to give opportunities to as many archers as we can. But please do remember that we are volunteers, and we only have a limited amount of time to do this. So for the para and the visually impaired categories, we would certainly like to tackle these, and any assistance people can provide with collecting data and helping us to develop the classifications would be more than welcomed, because we don't have a good level of experience in these categories. In terms of the other bow styles, again, so one question was how they should treat American flatbow. So at the moment in outdoor target, American flatbow and traditional are treated as barebow. Developing classifications for these bow styles, again, assistance in collecting data and helping developing these would be very much welcomed. Questions about longbows shooting the 70-meter round when barebows shoot the 50-meter round. The answer to this is that the 70-meter is currently the official 720 round for longbows. If this should change, so should there be a change such that the official round becomes, say, a WA 50 for longbows as well, then the classification tables would change to reflect this. But at the moment, like I say, the 70-meter is the official round. Some questions on the handicap scheme. So rich rounds are available for handicaps. Anything in tables 1 and 2 of the new handicap tables. So this does not include frostbites, and it does not include the distances. So say 3 dozen at 90 meters, 3 dozen at 60 meters. These tables are provided because they're useful for comparing performance. So if you shoot, say, a 1440 round, you can use those to look up your handicap for each individual distance and see actually how you are performing across the competition for each of those, rather than just the single overall score. Some questions: how do you convert your old handicap into a new one? The answer is that you don't. This is detailed in the changeover procedures, and what we've got is a new system. Instead of 0 to 100, it's 0 to 150, and the equations have changed. So even if you sort of an old handicap of 36 on a 1440 does not necessarily map to the same place as it would on the York Hereford. Everything has changed. Awarding the Handicap Improvement Medal. Again, this is, we made a recommendation about this in the changeover procedures, so please check those. At the end of the day, it's up to the club, and we would suggest that for this year only, you make some kind of appropriate adjustment, whether that's through a tournament, whether it's through freezing handicaps in the middle of the season, or whether you sort of calculate an initial handicap in some form. It's up to the club. And then from next year, it will revert to the standard procedure. Questions on the Excel calculator. So if you couldn't get it to work, please do try again. It has been updated to be compatible back to Excel 2010. Or alternatively, consider using one of the websites that Mark and I administer, or one of the apps that's been updated to provide functionality in the new system, which I know includes certainly Expert Archer at the moment, and Golden Records has also been updated. Finally, if you have any questions about administration, so if you're a club records officer and want help sort of, rather than understanding the systems, which is what this has been about, but rather than you have more questions about administering the systems, then Mark has written a very good series of articles linked from here, all about sort of guiding you through how to do this at a club level. And finally, these slides are already publicly available at this URL, and I'm sure Katie will share them after the talk when the recording goes up, and they're based on a longer written article that is also available and currently in progress. With that, that's the end of sort of the formal bits of presentation I've had, so we can move on perhaps to any questions that have come through.
Yeah, I think I've stayed on top of most of the questions in the chat. There's a few that we probably haven't answered. I mean, there's a couple of questions about different categories, different bow styles, horse-bow, and non-classified disabled archers. I think you already answered that, Jack, but maybe it's worth talking again. I mean, I think the general principle is, now that we have a framework for doing these classifications, if there's enough interest, enough data, and enough archers, then maybe we can look at it. But we need that data. We need enough data to be able to set sensible classification boundaries across all of the different age groups and categories there. So I guess the answer is that we're always looking for volunteers who have that experience in that category, have data if possible, to work on this with us. Joanne, Imogen, I was talking about your questions there. If you've got any, if you want to come back on that, please do. I think most of the other questions in here, I think we've covered already. There's one, maybe Katie, you could answer that. There was a question about if people hold multiple classifications at different age groups, like under 14 and under 16, will they get different badges? I think the answer is no. Is that right?
No, there will be, which I can come on now to discuss. There'll be a junior master bowman and consecutive 3 badges. There will be a 50 plus, and there will be a normal master bowman badge. There won't be one per age group, and the same process will apply. So as soon as you have that badge, you will not get a badge again. But for this year, anybody who claims any of the badges from master bowman up to elite will be given a new badge, even if you've had one in previous years. So you can all get the new badges if you wish. Before I go to the badge pictures, does anybody have any more questions for Mark and Jack? Nope. Okay.
And I should say that we are happy for people to reach out if they have genuine questions and want to try and understand this to sort of serve it to archers. We are more than happy for people to reach out for help.
The question here about the age group for 70 plus. More than happy to discuss it. It's just about numbers and the uptake first of the 50 plus round. So really it's a case of seeing how it goes this year, and then we'll start to work on potentially additional age groups. But in that we do need a group. We will need a group of volunteers to really decide on the actual rounds that they shoot, because at the moment 50 plus shoot one round down, and it's whether we carry that process forward. So that would be a wider discussion for the future.
And I think just on
Brian, sorry, go on.
So I was just going to say, I think there's a message here for tournament organisers amongst you as well, to just make sure you put on those rounds. Make sure you put on the 50 plus rounds. So I see a lot of tournaments now that are not offering the 50 plus rounds, and we're in a chicken and egg situation. If we want more, we need more 50 plus archers shooting those 50 plus rounds in order to justify doing other age categories. So yeah, there needs to be a leap of faith and to put those rounds on. The under 18s will shoot them as well, because they shoot the same distance. So it's definitely worth offering those rounds at least.
And for Brian, there's a question about the arbalist categories. I believe if you check the administrative procedures, none of those have changed. So in the same way that the indoor and the field classifications haven't changed at the moment in the SAPs, I believe the arbalist classifications are still the same as well as they always were.
John?
Hi. Yeah. Firstly, can I thank Jack, Mark and Mark on behalf of Archery GB. This has been an epic piece of work. Started before the pandemic, I believe, and the amount of research they've done to get this right. And I know it was delayed coming out, but we wanted to make sure it was as right as possible. And I'm glad we did hold it back a few times just to make sure we got it all right. We know there's still areas to pad out. We know there's 50, we could start going down 50 plus in every discipline. They're currently finishing off the work for the indoors, because that's going to change completely as well. So it's just huge, and we are getting there. And when this has been finished, then they're going to check all the data is correct and tweak it all again. So, but we will stick within the classifications, but they might just move up and down on the handicaps. So it has been epic, guys, and it truly appreciated by everyone. And it's nice to hear so much chatter about handicaps again. When I first started archery myself, I loved it and I really cared about it, and I felt they floated away a bit. So this has kind of reignited everybody as well into this. So with all the new badges, people will be getting really excited. As to 50 plus and adding in all the other age groups, I know at the World Masters they do 56. They actually start at 35, Graham, at the World Masters. So if you look at USA Archery, they have strong numbers now in 50, 60 and 70. But it's building up a base of people to have a competitive discipline. We need to do that first. So the more people who come, we can start adding in the extra layers. And then we can start having 50 plus rankings, as we keep getting requests for then, once we have enough people attending enough events. And a TO at any tournament can put on whatever age group they want. That's the TO's choice, remember. Ours are only recommendations. So does everybody want to see the new badges? So if you could, Jack, if you could let Katie have control of the screen, unless anyone else has got any other orders first. Okay. Here we go. So these are going to be the Archer 321 and the Bowman 321. We had several designs drawn up. They are currently awaiting, we're going to be ordering 50,000 of these pins, hopefully next week. 60,000, is it, Katie, almost?
Yes, about 60,000, yeah.
60,000 of these pins next week. I need one more signature from somebody at work, and then we can get them ordered. They are going to be distributed by one of the UK's leading archery shops for us. I'm not going to say who. Again, that needs signing off. I am hoping they will be in the shop no later than mid-August. They're going to be sold in 1s or 20s. Okay, so your club can order a 20, and there is a big discount on ordering a bag of 20. Okay, we are going to give, when a club makes its first order, we are going to give that club 20 Archer 3 badges for free. Okay, so we're giving out Archer 3 badges for free. And there will also be a dealer price, so any other archery shop in the UK can buy them and sell them in their shops as well, but only shops will be able to get the dealer price. These will be replacing the existing first, second, third and bowman badges, and these are the higher end badges replacing master bowman and grandmaster bowman. And as always with these, you will fill in your claim form, proof of where you've shot your scores at the appropriate tournaments. This will be administered by AGB and the badge will be sent to you. Again, I hope to be sending these out by September. Any earlier than that will be a bonus, but I'm not promising anything before September because they do have to be made and brought over to us. And then I imagine we will have a lot to distribute. Yeah. And again, if you're already a master bowman, you are allowed to get one of the new badges. So a lot of thought went into making these and bringing back. I don't know who has the older master bowman badges before the current ones, but I was always very glad I had the older one. Yeah. So any questions about the badges? Excellent.
Brilliant. Thank you all again so much for coming. Again, thank you, Jack and Mark, and Mark Tamlin as well. You've been awesome in this. If people do have any questions after this evening, do let us know. Either email me, email competitions, or feel free to actually use that link again for the survey that we put out previously, because Jack and Mark do have access to that as well. And yeah, again, thank you.